Shalom. Welcome to Hayom. I'm Rabbi Arnold Rachlis. We have with us a guest who has worked in some of the most interesting areas of contemporary Jewish life. The National Jewish Resource Center, founded by Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, which works to spread new ideas about Judaism throughout the American Jewish community. The National Chavurah Committee, which tries to establish chavurot within and outside of synagogues and to talk about new ways of davening and experiencing midrash and Torah. And most recently, he's the executive director of the Federation of Reconstructionist Congregations and Chavurot, the congregational arm of the Reconstructionist movement. Our guest is Rabbi David Teutsch. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
I'm delighted to be here, Arnie.
David, let's talk about what is Reconstructionism. It's a term some people have heard. It's the fourth movement in Jewish life, but people don't know much more than that.
Well, most people do know that it was founded by Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, who died this year at the age of 102. His watchword in defining Judaism was to call Judaism the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. To say that Judaism is evolving is to say two important things. The first is that the world is changing, and it's changing faster and faster, and that if Judaism doesn't adapt to that changing world, it won't be able to keep up. It will become an antique. The second aspect of the notion of evolution, however, is the idea that we have to not only change to keep up, but change to improve. A good example is the Reconstructionist response to a growing awareness of the need to fully equalize the role of women, so that the first bat mitzvah in the United States was at the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, Kaplan Synagogue, in 1922. The Reconstructionist Rabbinical College has admitted women on an equal footing with men to its rabbinical program since it was founded in '68, and so on. So Judaism is evolving, and it's religious. That means it's concerned with that which is ultimately important. When we lose track of the search for justice and goodness and truth, we are no longer being true to what Judaism is supposed to be about. And that it is a civilization, that it has its own art, music, dance, culture, philosophy, languages. And if we lose track of all that and we reduce it to being just religion, then we've taken one little fragment out of the culture and tried to make that the whole, and that can't work.
Very often, though, we hear about Reconstructionism being, since it's the newest movement on the block, it's sometimes thought to be more progressive or more radical or more far out, but really that isn't so. In a number of ways, it's quite traditional.
Well, to say that we're concerned with the evolving civilization of the Jewish people is to say that we want powerfully to have continuity with the past. One of Kaplan's greatest one-liners was that Judaism must have a vote, that the tradition must have a vote but not a veto. Today, more and more Jews are incapable of giving the tradition a vote because they don't know what's in it. So a strong emphasis in Reconstructionism is the discovery of our past, to learn traditional texts, to learn traditional values, and then only to change them where we see a reason to change.
If I were to go into a Reconstruction synagogue, what would I see?
Well, one of the things you'd see is a much greater informality and a sense of warmth and extended family. We have the idea that if you can't create a really tangible sense of community, you won't have a sense of belonging in the synagogue, and you won't feel a part of what the synagogue is supposed to be, which is a base for being Jewish. You would experience a service in which there was a goodly amount of Hebrew, a lot of singing, but also some creative and fresh English readings. Usually instead of a sermon, you would experience a dialogue or discussion. The idea being that while the rabbi has a lot of insights to offer from the Jewish tradition, there are many insights that other people in the congregation will have that are worth hearing and sharing also.
What is the role of lay people in Reconstructionist congregations? You mentioned that there's sermon dialogues. Obviously, if there's a dialogue, the lay people have to they have to bone up. Do they have to do some research themselves and some study?
There certainly is a need for lay people to feel full partners in the job of building the Reconstructionist and the Jewish future. And that means being responsible for a higher level of Jewish self-education. But I think that comes pretty naturally once you do what the Reconstructionists do, which is to emphasize that the synagogue should be a democratic community, and that decisions should be made through a process of discussion and investigation and then a democratic vote. When people don't have the right to decide, they don't feel much responsibility for educating themselves for good decision making. So by throwing an onus for a serious congregational process or Chabura process of joint decision making on our lay members, we think we've taken an important step for encouraging them to study and engage in a growth process that will allow them to make better decisions, not only communally, but also individually in their private lives.
What kinds of people come to Reconstructionism? I mean, it's very hard to have a Reconstructionist background because the movement ideologically is just 50 years old and institutionally much less. So they must come from Orthodox, conservative, Reform, and no background at all. But in the main, is there one group from which they come?
Well, the group that's surging into the movement now is overwhelmingly third and fourth generation American Jews, overwhelmingly younger people who don't really know very much about Judaism. Most of them, I would say, are interesting in their lack of significant Jewish education and Jewish experience, and they're very hungry. They're looking, I think, for Jewish spirituality, for a serious confrontation with Jewish tradition, and for a place that they can belong in the Jewish community that will accept them as they are and with their need to grow and experiment. It's an interesting thing that they don't feel very comfortable often in the standard synagogue, which is a somewhat more rigid and structured place. I think that's one of the reasons why the Reconstructionist movement is growing so fast. We've been growing at a little better than 20% a year for the last 4 years in a row. It seems to me to be a comment on the hunger that younger Jews feel for community and a sense of richness and experimentation, which isn't found very often in the liberal Jewish community.
If I were to come to a Reconstructionist synagogue, in fact, which I do very often since I'm a Reconstructionist rabbi, my synagogue's Reconstructionist, but if I were a person who didn't know much about Judaism, and I came to a Reconstructionist synagogue, and I felt disenfranchised from other kinds of synagogues because either intellectually I didn't agree with what they believed, or I always felt that the demands, the halachic demands, the demands for observing mitzvot were stronger than I was willing to partake of. What would the synagogue do to really take me from where I am as a disenfranchised, maybe somewhat alienated and angry Jew, even if I'm hungry, to make me into somebody who's really comfortable and well-rooted in the tradition?
Well, step one is to give you a chance to talk back. It's very unlikely that anyone will learn very much when they're angry and not allowed to speak, or feeling alienated and not allowed to talk about it. So we try to create both formal times like the Torah discussion and informal times like the Oneg Shabbat, where people really do talk about what they're there for and what their Jewish needs are and whether those needs are being met. That's stage one, I think. Second part of the challenge is to get people to experience things in a new way. Most people, for example, just casually throw a talit on when they come to services on Saturday morning. Encouraging people to experiment and notice the textures and what it's like to put them on, to draw them in experientially into the ritual is a very important thing. But that's a start. The real key, I think, is to provide enough basic Jewish learning in a non-judgmental, non-dogmatic, non-authoritarian way so that they can become excited by the riches in the tradition themselves. I don't want to teach people about Judaism. I want to help people discover Judaism by having direct contact with the primary sources.
And this is, in a sense, part of a broader movement for Jewish renewal, as it's called. It transcends just Reconstructionism. It's very much a part of the Chavurah movement, which you've been involved with also, to get people experiencing Judaism to do first and think later, but not to do things thoughtlessly. Right? The Jewish catalogs are evidence of that, and other kinds of phenomena. How does the Chavurah movement work with the Reconstructionist movement on this?
There's been a growing relationship. Many people don't know this, but in 1960 and 61, the Reconstructionists published a series of articles urging the formation of fellowships, which they then translated as Chavurot. And in fact, all of the Chavurot in the United States prior to 1968 were Reconstructionist. In 1968, the countercultural Chavurot, which were based principally in large eastern cities, Boston, Washington, New York, began, and they diverged from any official attachment to Reconstructionism. What's happened in the last few years is that a number of people who've had contact with both those worlds are now encouraging them to grow back together again, so that the Federation of Reconstructionist Congregations in Chavurot and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College have served as co-sponsors of the National Chavurah Committee. Many of the teachers from the then countercultural Chavurot are now established spokesmen inside the Jewish community, and many of those men and women are now teachers at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College.
What's really interesting is, recently we had Arthur Waskow as a guest on the show, and what's interesting is that Arthur Waskow, who at that time was in Washington working with the Farbrengen community, and Arthur Green, who had founded Chavurat Shalom in Boston, and Zalman Schachter, who was up in Canada, all working sort of different aspects of Jewish renewal, are now all at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Dr. Green is the dean. Dr. Waskow runs the Shalom Center, a peace center. Zalman Schachter teaches there as well as in Philadelphia at Temple University. Are they being attracted to the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and the movement because they sense something new is taking place in that seminary, not available other places?
There is no question but that there is a foment at the college that focuses on an attempt to do what Kaplan talked about, which is the need to reconstruct Judaism over again in each generation. There's an intellectual openness and an openness to spiritual experimentation, to the invention of new ritual, and also a desire to once again struggle with the primary text, which makes the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College a really exciting place and has attracted, I think, a wonderful student body. That's reflected in the same way in the Reconstructionist congregations and Chavurot across the country that are doing just that same kind of experimenting on a local level. And there's an openness to that which is new, as well as that from the tradition which may have remained there undiscovered in the last few years. That isn't very common, I don't think, in the American Jewish community as a whole. A willingness to take risks, knowing that standing still in a world changing as fast as ours is really going backward. People are attracted, I think, to that excitement and to the new energy that that excitement generates.
There are Reconstructionist rabbis serving in non-Reconstructionist congregations. I mean, I know that there are a good number of Reform rabbis serving in conservative congregations because there are more Reform graduates than pulpits, and there are fewer conservative graduates than pulpits. Likewise with Reconstructionism, there are a number of Reconstructionist rabbis who are serving in conservative and Reform pulpits as well. Is there some fear on the part of the movement and the college that the strength of the movement will be weakened or by putting graduates in non-Reconstructionist synagogues, or conversely that many of these synagogues will eventually come into the Reconstructionist movement?
There's no question in my mind that the more graduates we have in the field, the more people are going to be excited about Reconstructionism, the more they're going to hear about it, the more they're going to want to be involved in it. I think that's been part of the reason for our rapid growth in the last few years. On the other hand, it's true that we're not interested just in building a movement that labels itself officially Reconstructionist. We're also interested in the spread of Reconstructionist ideas and in influencing the other movements. And conversely, I am always happy to borrow something good that I see in the reform or conservative movements, and I'm not at all uncomfortable with acknowledging that we learn from each other. I think that's part of the richness of the American Jewish community. That richness comes from diversity. It seems to me, therefore, that our contacts with the other movement have really been salutary. And while I'm always worried to make sure Reconstructionist congregations get rabbis first, I'm not seriously worried about crossing over in either direction. The reverse has happened in a number of cases, too, where rabbis trained by the reform or conservative movements have wanted to take Reconstructionist pulpits because of the kind of excitement that often exists in Reconstructionist congregations and in a different way.
Let's talk about some of the specific ideas. When those who know about Reconstructionism very often will say, well, you know, I really agree with Reconstructionism about 90% of the way. You hear this very often from conservative and reform rabbis especially, but, they say, the theology. It's difficult for me to accept a naturalistic, humanistic, non-supernaturalistic theology. Can you tell us about Kaplan's thought or Reconstructionism's thought about what God is, the reality of God?
Reconstructionists say that God is a transnatural force in the universe, that the divine is inside each person and inherent in the structure of the world and in nature, but that God is not a king on a throne. Or to put it a little differently, the challenge of the biblical period was to rid us of coarse idolatry, the worship of multiple gods. The challenge of the medieval period was to rid us of gross anthropomorphism and anthropopathism, the idea that God has a body or that God has particular feelings. I think the challenge of our time is to take the next step and say that God in the universe is not an individual actor, but rather is acted out through our actions. Kaplan said that his theology, and he defined God as the power that makes for salvation, was only one optional theology within Reconstructionism. What he saw as being essential to Reconstructionism is that we are transnaturalist or naturalist. I would say very, very few Jews in America are prepared to make the claim that they accept all of the Torah as having been given at Sinai, and therefore that they are bound by each and every individual mitzvah that's contained in the Torah in a literal fashion. There are fewer Jews around, I think, than most people realize, who are prepared to say that God intervenes in their lives and does individual miracles on a one-on-one basis. I would argue that most of us see God inside human potential and inside the potential of the world to be moved toward perfection. And that therefore Reconstructionism in its transnaturalism is much closer to where most people are, if they're really willing to admit it, than most realize.
I think that's, in a sense, part of the problem, that people will say, well, sure, in my more rational, intellectual, day-to-day moments, I don't believe in a supernatural God. I don't believe in a God who sits above and intervenes in nature and creates miracles. But when someone's sick, I want to pray to that kind of personal supernatural God. When I'm afraid of death, I want that kind of God. When bad things happen to me, I want to pray to that kind of God. Or they say, sure, it's not true, but it's not Jewish not to believe in a supernatural God. You know what I mean?
Sure, there are those kinds of problems, but I think that's partly because we've not been very effective in talking about God in the last few years. One recent survey suggested that most rabbis only talk about God on Friday night a couple of times a year.
I think most rabbis only talk about God in interfaith dialogue, to tell you the truth.
So I think one of the reasons why people walk around with those kinds of feelings is they haven't had much of an opportunity to air their views on the subject and to be stimulated to think more carefully about them. I would argue that God, insofar as people experience God in their lives, is a quality that they discover within, that can inspire and change their lives, that can be a source of power and calm and serenity, and that there is something right about saying, yes, I reach for the divine at times of trouble. It's not wrong to say, I need the comfort of God when I'm sick or when I'm faced with death. The serenity that flows from that power within is a really powerful tool in dealing with those kinds of crises. But that doesn't mean we have to depend on a narrow supernaturalistic vision. And quite frankly, in responding to either the tragedy of an individual child dying seemingly needlessly, or the tragedies of our generation, whether the Holocaust or Hiroshima, it seems to me very, very hard to talk about individual reward and punishment and individual justice. I'm glad that my view of God and Reconstructionist view doesn't require me to explain those events in terms of God's action in our individual lives. I think if we admit that human beings bring down much of the tragedy in our world, and that human beings inspired by the divine must act together to do something about that tragedy, the world is likely to be moved to being a much healthier place than it is now.
Well, a lot of people have been introduced to Reconstructionist theology without even knowing it through Harold Kushner's books, When Children Ask About God and When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He's someone who in thought is indebted to Kaplan and to Reconstructionism. And so, in a way, the kind of response we've seen to especially when bad things happen to good people, I think it's really touched something in Jews and Christians throughout America, really an unbelievable phenomenon, I think.
And insofar as many of our spiritual troubles flow from our inability to break with the secular materialistic culture in which we live, and therefore our need to go to psychological rationalizations for our problems, Kushner's book, which really is a Reconstructionist book, says something very important about the need to recapture a theological initiative and to see the world in a grander perspective than many of us tend to. I think people are inspired by that book because there is a struggle for the Jewish soul going on, and people would like a spiritual answer that is not childish, nor superstitious, nor simple-minded, and yet is sensible from the point of view of a highly educated and rational perspective.
Well, one of the things that the Reconstructionist movement has tried to pioneer in are life cycle ceremonies. You mentioned before that Mordechai Kaplan's daughter, Judith, was the first bat mitzvah in 1922. But more recently, the Reconstructionist movement has spent about 3 years discussing an intermarriage proposal, how to deal with the increasing number of intermarried couples in the Jewish community. Do you want to talk a little about that and the place of the rabbinate in this issue?
Okay. The first thing I always say about in any discussion about intermarriage is the symptom. And while it may be a problem, it's not the central problem. The problem is that we're living in an open society where people don't ask me or you or any other rabbi about what they ought to do with their lives. They make those decisions themselves based on a great complexity of values. That makes their lives much richer, but it also makes Judaism much more tenuous in terms of their accessibility to it. So the first thing we should understand is that what rabbis decide to do about officiating or not officiating has almost nothing to do, as nearly as we can tell, on whether people will intermarry. The second is that we ought to be engaged in massive outreach, not only to intermarried couples, but to younger Jews in general, who lack basic Jewish education and basic Jewish experiences. If we want to create a dynamic Jewish community, we've got to reach out to singles and couples, and we should realize that a lot of intermarried couples would be delighted to be significant in serious parts of the Jewish community if we welcome them and educate them and provide them the basis for doing so. So the most important part of the new proposals is to be as serious in doing outreach as possible. As to officiation itself, that's only a final piece of a process. The first thing we're saying to rabbis is reach out to couples who come to see you, spend time with them, talk to them, get to know them, help them understand some of the complexities of the issues. If they're Jewishly serious, help them do some Jewish study, offer courses that are suitable to couples considering intermarriage that will introduce them to the Jewish tradition. And then, at that point, you're in a position to say, well, are these people Jewishly serious? Are they going to create a Jewish home? Are they going to educate their kids Jewishly? And if the answer to those questions is yes, then you've got to try and figure out a way to arrange the part of this that's the ceremony itself in a way that will bring them closer to the Jewish community. Does that mean that you should be there when a justice of the peace performs the ceremony and add words of your own after the wedding ceremony is concluded? That seems to be one viable option that's emerged from discussions by the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association. Should there be new ceremonies? There was a recent one published in the Reconstructionist magazine, which was certainly not an end in itself, was a model of a possible non-kiddushin, non-technical Jewish ceremony that was nonetheless a religious ceremony appropriate to a couple that's intermarrying. I think we're going to have to experiment with that too. And I think we've got to say, if the goal of a rabbi is to preserve the integrity of the Jewish tradition and the length and breadth of the Jewish people, that rabbis in their roles as officiants have got to figure out creative ways to drawing these people who may well become the Jewish leaders of tomorrow 10 years or 20 years after they intermarry, and very often will be involved in conversion and a deeper experience of Judaism than many people who've never been involved with non-Jews. They need our support. They need us, but we need them too. We ought to be reaching out to them, engaging them, and if that means coming up with new ritual, then that's what we should be doing.
Are there other groups within the Jewish community that need new rituals, or other life cycle ceremonies that need new rituals?
Well, I don't think we've come up yet with the final answer for Brit Benot Yisrael, the ceremonies of welcoming our daughters into the covenant. We've been experimenting with them for about the last 25 years, and I think we've come a long way. But after all, the standard Brit ceremony for boys, Brit Milah, developed over a few thousand years, and it's not surprising that we're not there yet. Another big challenge has to do with prayer writing. There's no question but that we have to go much farther than we've yet been able to do toward creating fully equalized male and female language for prayer. We need new ceremonies, I think, also for reconciliation when couples fight. I think other parts of the life cycle we haven't dealt with yet, like retirement, need more attention than they've got.
But all that is, you're saying, fertile, those are fertile areas for applying Jewish creativity to come up with something spiritual.
Part of what the tradition should do is hallow each part of our lives. And insofar as we have new life events, we should be generating new ritual that helps us to find meaning in those events.
Well, thank you for giving us meaning in this half hour. We really appreciate your presence here. Please write to Rabbi Teutsch at the Federation of Reconstructionist Congregations in Chavurot in New York. Find out from him about how to get the Reconstructionist magazine and where Reconstructionist congregations in Chavurot are, and ask him some of those questions, theological and spiritual and intellectual, that maybe Reconstructionism can say something about. And please join us again soon on Hayom. Shalom.